So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Disability Awareness Week at Kingsborough Community College. My name is Peter Santiago. I am the Associate Director of Accessibility Services at KCC. On behalf of the college and my office, I thank you for joining us today. Our office values all identities and abilities. As such, every year in April, we host Disability Awareness Week with events centered around disability-related theme. This year's theme is autism and identity. Throughout the week, we hope to provide insight into the lived experience of people on the autism spectrum through a movie screening, some panels, and an art show. We're hoping that through these events, we will all learn what it's like for some people on the spectrum to fall in love, what it's like to raise a child on the spectrum, what we can do as a society to value individuals on the autism spectrum for who they are as people, what it's like to be a student at KCC as a person on the spectrum. And finally, we'll be treated to works of art created by students on the spectrum attending KCC. This week, we're very fortunate to have individuals on the spectrum or their parents that are willing to share their experiences with us. While planning these events, we've tried not to speak for people on the spectrum, but instead tried to amplify their voice, help to share their experiences, and showcase their talents. While the panel is in session, I'd like to ask that everyone please turn off your video and remain muted until the Q&A. Out of consideration for our folks using screen readers, try not to use a public chat unless you are having some kind of technical difficulty or want to ask a question during the Q&A. People using a screen reader will hear a sound every time a message is sent in the chat. So it's kind of like hearing text go off while you're in the movie theater. So if you have a question or some technical issue, please message me directly so as to minimize the distractions. As you may have noticed, we will be using audio transcript feature on Zoom to provide captions. But we also have sign language interpreters helping us throughout the panel. If you would like to turn off the captions, find the little CC button on the Zoom control panel, click it, and select Hide Subtitles. I hope you all enjoy the panel. I'll hand the mic over to our moderator for today, Vincent Carrasquillo. Take it away, Vincent.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vincent Carrasquillo. I am a third-year student at the Melissa Riggio Higher Education Program at Kingsborough Community College, and I'm majoring in radio broadcasting major and planning to be a future musicianist. I was on the autism spectrum at the age of 2, and my parents revealed it to me when I was 16 years of age. I was shocked at first, but at the end of the day, I started to realize that it doesn't matter to me. I was happy that I have something that I wanted to do to succeed myself in the future and to gain confidence on what is it like to have an intellectual disability and to also gain confidence on what I want to do for my future and my life. And now I will introduce you to the panelists who I'll be asking the questions for today. So the reason why we are here today is to gain some insights of the experience of the parents of people on the spectrum. And now, as I said again, which my apologies, I will now ask the panelists to introduce themselves.
Okay, I'll start. My name is Stella Woodruff, and I guess most of you know that I'm the director of accessibility services, and I'm here because I have a son who has autism, and he is now 38 years old. As a matter of fact, he'll be 39 this year.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Tashika Sutton-Young. I serve as the Chief of Staff to the President and the Interim Vice President of College Advancement here at KCC. And I have a daughter who is a preteen who is on the spectrum.
Hi, I'm Paul Winnick. I'm the Director of Operations for Performing Arts and Event Facilities. Short, I handle the events for the college. I have a son who is on the spectrum. He's 22, and he actually graduated Kingsborough a couple of years ago.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Maximo, and I'm the Associate Director of the Kingsborough Learning Center. And I have a son who's on the spectrum. He is 7 years old and currently in the 2nd grade.
Okay. All righty. So, and now we will get to our questions. Here we go, everybody. So our first question is, how old is your child now? And what age was your child diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum?
So my daughter is 11 years old and she was diagnosed when she was 18 months old.
My son is 10 years old, and he was diagnosed when he was 3 years old.
And as I mentioned, my son is 22, but he was diagnosed at about 18 months. 18 months old.
And as I said before, my son is 38, but he was not diagnosed until he was an adult. I believe he was in his early 20s.
Okay. So reflecting on how the doctors explained it to you, what did the doctor do well and what could they have done better? What was the formal diagnosis?
So my daughter wasn't diagnosed by her pediatrician. Her pediatrician sent us to a center-based program that was located in Bay Ridge for her to go through a series of tests and exams. And then we were sent to a developmental pediatrician at LIJ Cohen's Children's Hospital in New Hyde Park, where she then went through another series of testing with the developmental pediatrician, and then she was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, or before it became autism spectrum disorder, it was PDD. So that's what we were.
So, my son, I was concerned, and I went to my pediatrician and said, I'm very concerned about his development. And the reaction that I got was not very pleasant. And so I changed pediatrician and went somewhere else to a developmental pediatrician, where he got the proper I was referred to an agency, and where he received the proper diagnosis of autism/ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
With my son, when he was originally diagnosed, it was ADHD and PDD. And now we know that as the basically Asperger's. But our pediatrician was phenomenal. I mean, he caught at close to 18 months. So as I said, we were concerned because, my son had vocalized up to a certain point and then just stopped, and then there were certain milestones that the doctor was looking at, and he just pegged it out. He said, okay, this is what, he didn't say to us, this is what I think it is or not, but he said, I really do want you to get it checked out. And he gave us names of some really excellent people. And so we were able to get, early intervention and everything going at a good point in time. So
my experience is so very, very different from each of these experiences. And I think it was partly because of my son's age. The way autism was defined back in the 80s is certainly not what it is now. And so my son was not diagnosed as a child because he did very well in school. The school never picked up on anything. As a matter of fact, I was the one who put a name to what I was seeing. The way you determine whether a person has autism, a lot of it has to do with their history. So they do a lot of social history. interviewing parents and teachers and all of that stuff. Well, I had all the information, so I was the one who recognized what was happening. And at the time, that would have been a diagnosis of Asperger's, not autism. It's only very recently that autism and Asperger's were compiled under the umbrella of autism. So he really had a diagnosis. I noticed it and then spoke with his doctors who confirmed Asperger's. But he
Mhm.
was already, I believe, at college at the time that happened.
Okay, so our next question is, how did it feel? What were some of your initial reactions? What were some of your concerns related to your child's identity? After you found out, how have your feelings and perspective changed, if at all?
I guess I can start. I felt very alone. Like, as I said, the first pediatrician told me just to, kids develop at various, rates and kind of wait it out. I felt very dismissed. And it was just not a good start for us. So I had to then, which is why he was officially diagnosed at the age of 3. It's because I had to figure out what the path was, and almost all by myself. My husband is a great supporter, but it felt like a very lonely journey in the very beginning. But having that official label was the beginning of something great for my son and I, because now we knew what it was, we knew what to call it, and those were my initial reactions. So my concerns were, now that we have a label and we know what it is, what do I do? And living in New York City, you have to figure out or navigate how to access resources. And so that was, I didn't anticipate that being a big issue, but it actually was. So advocating for my son became sort of my part-time job. And I relied mostly on family or friends outside of my household. My husband was supportive, but I ran to Stella because I knew she would give me, she listened to what I had to say and pointed me to the right direction. And just find external support and to build a network for my son and I, because we needed it. So it was, and he's 7 years old, so we're still at the start of our journey. But it's also getting to know my son and seeing how he tries and how he's improved in terms of what we ask him to do, and finding ways to communicate with them has been something that I could never have imagined. So the journey is hard. It's a struggle to advocate, to be a supportive parent, to factor in your culture and tell people, no, my son is not different in terms of a negative way. He just does things differently. But interacting with him and just getting to know him, I didn't anticipate that being a joyful and very interesting experience. And I learned from him every day. I mean, he's on a mission to count to 1 billion right now. And I don't know what to do about that, but every day he has this thing where he adds 50 little dots to something until he reaches 1 billion. Will he ever make it? I don't know, but it's just interesting to watch him do that and to say, well, you can do it. So yeah, I hope I answered all the questions.
I think so.
I guess I'll go next. I think for me, when my daughter, I have an older daughter who, walked and talked and did everything, ahead of all the milestones by the time she was 8 months old. And so when her little sister came along and wasn't doing any of those things, didn't babble, didn't crawl, didn't walk, didn't do anything that she was supposed to do in the milestones, you get nervous and you get concerned and you're like, why is this not happening? And you try not to compare your children because they tell you don't compare them, but you can't help as a parent say, well, why isn't she hitting this, or why is this not happening? And so, you know, when we got the diagnosis, it was for me, okay. You know, for me, it was a validation saying I wasn't crazy. I knew something wasn't right. I had my concerns. And so for me, it was, you know, for folks who know me, know my personality. I had a diagnosis and then I made a plan. That was it. There was nothing else that needed to do, because by any means necessary, she needed the service and she was going to be successful in my eyes or in my family's eyes. So it was, you know, we've got a diagnosis. Now we need to get her into early intervention, and then we need a center-based program. And then so there was a plan for her every step of the way. For me, I think the concerns that hovered over me was how my family would take it, right? So I'm a Caribbean American, and so when you have a disability of any kind, there is stigmatism that falls on that within our community and within our families. And so it was about educated my family and my extended family about what is autism and what does it mean. And it doesn't make her any different from folks. It just makes her do things in a different way, right? And so, and she may learn in a different way, or may not be as fast at learning something as her sister would do it. So it was me pushing her, right? So her sister took dance, so she took dance. Her sister took swimming, so she took swimming. Anything that her sister took, she was in it, because my goal was to say, look, she can do anything as long as she put her mind to it. But the challenge for me was really just getting my extended family on board to understand what it was, and to also really, for me, I had to remove any toxic energy from her, around her. Anyone who had negative things to say or didn't want to invite her to a party or invite her to an event, those folks had to be removed from my circle, because my circle of trust needed to be people who supported her, who can support me as a mom, and support my husband and my other daughter. So I make sure I surround myself with people who are supportive of us and supportive of her. But it does get really stressful when, you know, your friends are in, and, you know, her sister has friends and they're invited to parties and they go to movie nights and they do sleepovers and events like that. But, you know, she doesn't get to do that. So, you know, mom and her will have sleepovers, and mom and her will have our own dance parties, and we'll go do our own shopping spree, because, you know, she doesn't really connect well with many folks. But for me, she has been a blessing, and I think she's perfect. And I hope that answers all of your questions, Vincent.
Yes, that's good. Very good.
Yeah, I was gonna, I mean, when you ask how did it feel, when he was diagnosed, kind of like a gut punch to me. And I was in denial for a long time with it. My wife really handled a lot of it. And so, I mean, I was there. I mean, I would, you know, make sure we got to all the doctor's appointments and everything else. But, and I was there to make sure, you know, to be able to have all the services that were coming in, because we would have a speech therapist and you know, physical therapy and a play therapy and a few others that were coming in and working on that. And my wife really put all that together. She stayed home for most of his transit, you know, from time he was diagnosed till very recently. She only went back to work recently. And so, yeah, so, you know, in terms of how it felt, that's, you know, and from my perspective as the father, I mean, you know, certain things would happen that were just really strange. Like when he stopped vocalizing, for example, I was blaming it kind of on my wife and my oldest son in a way, because, you know, we would ask him a question, you know, and rather than him answering, I would hear two other answers, you know, everybody was trying to talk for him at that time. And so I said, oh, well, it's because you're talking for him, or you're doing this, you're doing that, whatever. So as far as his identity, I got to tell you, he created his own personality really, really fast. You know, those of you at Kingsborough who know him know that he's, you know, he's got a personality. And he speaks his mind, and all that. So, and as far as my perspectives have changed in this, yeah, no, I mean, I've, grown with it. I work with him all the time. Not much to work with at this point because he's doing most on his own, but I've come to accept it, and work with it and not look at it in any negative way. It's not a negative. It's, I mean, it's so many positives, with him. I mean, he really is. I mean, bright. Uh, he teaches me a lot of stuff every day. Believe me. He's getting very involved in politics and all the news of the day, and it's what he does. So.
Um, my son grew up without a label, without a diagnosis. So he just was who he was and was accepted for who he was. He was a little idiosyncratic. That's what people thought. Um, but he just was Kwaku and people accepted him. Um, when, but of course, there were always things. Honestly, I thought he had ADHD when he was younger. If I had to guess, that's what I would have said it was. Um, it's only when Asperger's was put into the DSM-4 as a diagnosis that I was aware of it, because before then, something like autism was very different from what my son was. So my challenge was a little different. We realized as he became older, an older teen and young adult, when the need to socialize with others became so much more important. I'm glad to hear you say that you do stuff with your daughter, Tashika, but after a while, they don't want to do stuff with you anymore. They want to be with friends. And my son had a lot of difficulty in college where he wanted to go party and stuff like other people were doing. And that became an issue. That's when we had the real difficulty. And that's about when he got his diagnosis. So now we're looking at an adult who has to redefine who he is, and a whole family that now has to grapple with this diagnosis, this new idea of what of what is. Um, so instead of and yes, because I am also from the Caribbean, and my husband is from Africa. We are very traditionalist in how we see things, and so how do you get people to even accept? And it's much harder when you're asking them to accept an adult as having a diagnosis that they didn't know anything about before. And so, yeah, there was a lot of dismissal. Oh, come on, you know. And of course, I'm the one who got dismissed because I was just, I happened to be a licensed mental health counselor. So, I was the one doing the psychology thing again. Um, but it took a while, but I think eventually everyone simply accepted it. And I think it was easier for people to accept it because he still was who he always was. Nothing changed. For me, the diagnosis was simply a way of explaining um, behaviors and issues that I had seen all along anyway. It was just a reason to explain it. It didn't change anything. And I think that as people realize that he still was who he always was, still the same lovable person, um, it was easier to accept. The difficulty he had with his identity came somewhat from the autism, but also from the anxiety and depression that was comorbid with the autism. And that is common. Lots of people who are autistic also have issues with anxiety and depression, and my son did. And I think we had more difficulty dealing with the anxiety and depression than with the actual autism itself.
Oh, very clever. So to make this long story short, Stella, I do understand what you're trying to say. It makes total sense because before we go to the next question, I'm going to make this long story short for respect. There comes a times when people on the spectrum who is hard to get accepted by people who with non-disabilities and non-people who are on the spectrum, because most of the time it's hard for them to communicate with people. And some people on the spectrum has some kind of different disorders in life that some people cannot understand it properly or probably confused with it. But at the end of the day, when you start to understand what this person has been gone through in life, they will know right now or someday they will understand the process of what life is like to have an intellectual disability while that other person doesn't have a disability, so it can connect with each other like a puzzle. So that's my statement to you, Stella. I just want to make it very clear that I understand everything, and I thank you for that so much.
You're welcome, Vinny.
So for my next question is, how do you think the world understands people on the spectrum? How does race, gender, sexuality, and other types of diversity feed into that understanding?
Well, I'll tell you right now, my son is a black male. And that absolutely makes a difference. We know the issues with black males in society right away, and the stereotypes that they are, the way people perceive them. And then you take a black male with autism, who may not be the best at explaining themselves or fighting for themselves or, advocating. And it could be an issue. I can't tell you, there have been many a time that my son has been approached by the police just because he's standing in Penn Station or something and told, no, you can't stand here. Why? Well, you can't just stand here, you have to move on. For what reason? And and very often he has come home with the frustration of that. Sometimes because he had difficulty expressing how he felt to the person who was, moving him on. And so he came home and it's very frustrated. And you can hear it in the struggle to just explain how he feels. And because his voice he tends towards a flat tone, so that even when he is expressing frustration or anger, you don't get much of a change in the modulation of his voice. So you have to know him pretty well to understand how angry or frustrated he may be, or even happy. Happy doesn't show too well either. It all just sounds the same way. That can be a little frustrating. He's also very, very bright. Very bright. Right now, he is master's level licensed engineer. So he's very bright, struggled through college, but that was because of organization and stuff. But again, if you sound a certain way, people make assumptions about you before they actually get to know you. If you look a certain way, people make assumptions before they get to know you. And that's not just race, that's, that's gender, that's socioeconomic background, that's everything. People just look at you and make assumptions. And they don't often take the time to really get to know the person behind the facade. And I think especially with people on the spectrum, it's so important to get behind what you see, the facade that you see, and get to know the person that is behind that, the person who may not be expressing themselves that well, or who may not be expressing emotion the way you think they should express the emotion. It's so important to get to know that person in order to appreciate them. Did I answer the question? I'm sorry. Sometimes I go off on my soapbox here.
Yes, you did. You did
Okay.
fine, Stella. You did fine. It's okay. We all went through that.
So
What are your thoughts, Tikisha? I'm
So I
sorry,
think
Tikisha.
it's okay. I'm not at the sexuality part yet, so I'm gonna pray that stays off for a long period of time.
It's coming. It's coming.
Stop it. Stop. But I will say, of the panel, 3 out of the 4 us dealing with males, and I have a daughter, and so where I see that becomes challenging is, this, you look at the statistics and, 1 out of 7 children, but most of those will be males, right? And so my daughter oftentimes is the only female in a program, or the only female in her class, or, or one of 2 in the class, or one of 2 in the program. And so for her to connect with, young ladies of her age is very difficult for her, because all of her programs and all of the things that is around her with special needs children is mostly always male in the group. And so we formed this Girls Wednesdays for her and her mentor in the school, where they bring in other girls to come and have lunch with them at lunchtime on Wednesdays. And, they connect and they talk about female concerns or issues, because they are pre-puberty, and so they have those conversations with the school counselor or with the school nurse that happens. So I'm thankful for that. But the only concern with her is that 90% of the time she is the only female in the group or in the program. All that other stuff I'm going to hold off on discussing until she's about 45.
Wow.
You might have to make it 43, but anyway. The society, I mean, the world understanding it, I think it has a long way to go. I think the world may be learning a little bit, but it's got a long way to go. You deal with schools, for example, and even the most understanding person in the school system still can't relate necessarily. They understand it, they know it, but they can't see it from, at the time, the child's perspective or what he's going through. So it's education. I mean, it just has to keep going. We have to keep learning more about it. And then, again, when my son is concerned, I didn't face some of the, situations that Stella's son, for example, was facing. We've kind of kept him very close to the vest, right? He goes out a little bit on his own. He doesn't really want, he doesn't want to, whatever. But when he was in school, he came to Kingsborough. He was there. I was there. And his hideaway might have been my office or whatever. And so he didn't have that situation. When he was in school, he did have, he was in programs where he had, kids who were friends of his, and they still are, but they're very few. I mean, he has one or two face-to-face friends. Most of all of his friends are, on the internet, whatever that, these groups that he's part of or whatever on his computer. So when you ask, how's the world understanding it? I think we live in a pretty, sometimes a very myopic world. They don't want to see it. They're afraid. They look at too many other problems around. But my hope is it's going to get better. My hope is people are going to be educated in it. I mean, I look at when he tries to go get a job, for example. He does he works at a summer camp every summer. Okay. They know him. He grew up there. He became a staff member there and all of that. But the rest of the year, when he's gone in, and try to find something or put an application in, nothing comes of it. They don't even look at it yet. Probably he would be one of the best employees they would have doing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But they can't get past the part of that he it takes time. Listen, you can even hear me. I mean, I'm struggling to figure a sentence out. Okay, now put it to somebody who can't get it out fast enough either. So.
Mm-hmm.
So this makes all sense because another long story short, most autistic people go through this though, because some autistic people get stressed out easily or raising anxiety that easy because over certain things that no other people shouldn't have to worry about, but it's our this is who we are, because for most autistic people, they don't know that it's just a small thing, but it is. But at the end of the day will get better. And like what Walt Disney always says, just keep on moving forward and do not worry about it the next day. That is my theory of what I perceive.
So true. That is very true.
Thank you.
Very true.
So for our next, thank you very much. So our next question is.
But Madeline didn't answer yet.
I didn't answer. And I won't
sorry.
take very long.
My apologies.
That's okay. So I think there is a lot more education to be done, and communities throughout our country. But as a mom raising a Black male, I'm concerned because my son, he's brilliant. He's just so smart, but he has a lot of time expressing himself to his peers, to myself, to our friends. And so I watch him struggle to connect with his little cousins, and they talk about him in front of him as if he has no understanding. He doesn't understand, or he can't play this game. And my son just stares, and it makes me incredibly sad. So I'll educate my sister-in-law and my cousins and say, maybe teach your, the cousins to not at least talk in front of him because he does understand. Mm-hmm. But it's a process. It takes a lot. But what concerns me more as a Black male with autism is not even the puberty stuff, but just him driving and having autonomy and being without me. It puts the fear of God in me because I imagine him being stopped.
Oh yeah.
Not being able to express himself or just be frustrated in the process of explaining himself. And so I have plans and written some goals of, as he gets older, I need to make sure he understands the world in this way, that you're a Black autistic male, and there are certain things that I really need you to understand really well. And I shouldn't have to do that in a world that understands, that we all operate differently. But it's something that you have to take into consideration if you're raising a child who's that's autistic. Whether it's male, female, you really have to have a plan. But I feel that a Black male, there are layers that you really have to address. And I wish it wasn't that way, because it would make us parents less, you would let go a little bit easier. But you really have to plan and think these things through, because you want to make sure your child is informed and protected.
Oh, I can't tell you.
100%.
I can't tell you what happened but what I went through when my son started driving, and he wanted to drive. And oh my goodness, I have a strong heart. I must have a strong heart because I lived through it. And then the first day that one day he after a while I'd give him the car, he'd go driving. And one day we were at home, and the door flung open and he comes in, and I could see he's all upset. And I'm like, what happened? What happened? Where's the car? Well, he got into an accident. Luckily, it was not very far from home. It was within walking distance of home. And I went, and what are you doing here? Well, he left to come tell us. Now, you don't leave the scene of an accident.
Oh my gosh.
Exactly. Because he felt he needed to come tell us about it. I had to race him back to the accident. Go, right. But, and he's trying to explain it. I'm like, I don't need you to explain. Just need you to get back there. And then I sent my husband, just go. And at times like that, the husbands never move fast enough for us. Like, you're not moving fast enough. Get up, get so yes, I know I've been through that, but I'm on the panel to tell you guys you'll survive, because I'm still here. I survived.
Yes, amen to that.
We need all the encouragement we can get.
Yeah, oh yeah.
All the encouragement we can get.
And the encouragement that we need to do is that when it comes to like people who have an intellectual disability or other disabilities who want to drive, it's like it's not that easy for them, because some articulate people are judgmental because they think they can't drive. There are other different ways how people with disabilities or intellectual disabilities can drive, because it's a life experience what they've gone through, because there are many different ways how people can go places if they're handicapped or like, on wheelchairs, crutches, etc. But what matters is that everybody is the same. Everybody has to be what they are, what they want to do with their lives as a person, as people on the autism spectrum should understand the society.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very convenient understanding, and it makes kind of sense how people can relate to that. Like, if they understand like how they handle on the road, or how do they feel if they get a ticket, but at the end of the day, you got to take it smooth as a smoothie. That's what I say to myself when I get into situations like this.
I like that.
Take it smooth as a smoothie. Yes.
I like that.
Thank you. So I don't mean to say this in front of everybody, because I sometimes have difficult understanding certain things, but as I got older, I start to understand certain things in life once I got older. So I kind of on the same page right here. So our next topic of our question: what does your child like to do for fun? How does your child practice self-care? How has the pandemic affected these pursuits?
Okay, I'll start. My daughter absolutely loves music. So she will sing at the top of her lungs. She will watch YouTube videos. Before the pandemic, she took ballet, tap, and jazz. So she's a dancer. And so, I would be in dance on Saturdays, and then we have recitals and costumes and this and that. And so she's a girl's girl. She loves anything with glitter and pink and purple. Those are her colors. So she loves dance and music. She likes to engage with her sister. So she will spend a lot of time trying to dress like her sister. And her sister's a teenager, and teenagers don't want to talk to anyone, including their younger siblings. So her sister's not a fan of hers right now, but they'll come around. She practices self-care because we've spent a lot of time talking about hygiene. We spent a lot of time showing her how to take care of herself. Stella gave you a story, but she's 11, and so we're talking about doing laundry and how you do laundry and how you separate your laundry and so on and so forth. And she comes upstairs and she says, "Madre, I did my laundry." I said, "You did your laundry?" "Yes." And so I came downstairs, and in my dryer was all of her clothes and all of the Tide in the dryer. So it never went into the wash. It was in the dryer. So my dryer's going and it's blue because the Tide is drying in the clothes in the dryer because she's trying to do her laundry. She's trying to be like her big sister. I can do my laundry, And we spend time talking about that. We spend time about anything that has to do with hygiene, whether it's how to brush her teeth, whether it's how to put on roll-on, and all of these things. And so, with a young lady, you also have to worry about her monthly cycle and things like that you don't necessarily worry about when you have a male son. And so that conversation was a difficult conversation to have with her and her teacher. I love her to death, made an entire picture book on how you handle this. And we went to a whole workshop on how parents handle daughters on the spectrum who go through puberty and all these other issues. And so we've done all of that with her, and she's on track, and she's doing really well with that. However, we're not going to be doing laundry anytime soon because I'm trying to clean my dryer out with the blue Tide in it.
Well, I'll
That's
tell you,
beautiful.
I will tell you this, by the time they're in their 20s, they can do laundry. It's interesting. My son's a gamer. He loves sitting on his computer, playing all these video games and all these, against you or whatever it is. So how has the pandemic affected him? It has been the greatest thing to ever happen to him. Now he has an excuse to stay in his room and play his games or sit on his phone or do whatever and not have to go outside. Hey, you want to come with us to the store? No, I can't. There's a pandemic. Things like that. I am lucky in the sense that he said from when he was very young he never wanted to drive, so I was okay with that. I wasn't gonna fight that one. As far as taking care of himself, self-care and all of that, we were lucky in the sense that again, he has an older brother, so he was able, he liked mimicking everything his older brother did, so that helped. Then I had him in Boy Scouts because his older brother was an Eagle Scout, and he went into Scouts, and he stayed pretty much till he aged out at 18. But a lot of the skills that he learned were how to take care of himself, because he'd go on camping trips. I would make sure, as one of the leaders in the troop, actually, what we always did is when our kids were with us on any of these trips, we weren't allowed to talk to our kids the whole weekend. You see, we would be with some of the other scouts, but our young kids had to be with other leaders. And there was a reason for that. It was to get them used to talking to other adults and to be able to learn without, because you could have a helicopter parent who, I'll do it for you or whatever. And this way it gave them the opportunity to learn. But what I would do is I take it a step further. Sometimes I wouldn't even go on the camping trips, but I would be nearby. So my wife and I would make a weekend, for example, if they were up at a campground upstate New York, we would go find, a hotel nearby, and we would stop in and visit during the day for a few minutes, just to see that everything was okay. But it taught him how to do a lot of things. And plus, he has certain chores. He has to vacuum, or he has to do his own laundry. We don't do his laundry for him. He can cook simple things, which are important. And, so that's really how you bring them up to that kind of self-care, I guess, and in hopes that as he gets older, when he has to kind of be out on his own, he'll be able to. We'll see how successful that turns out. And I'll let you know in the next chapter of this in a few years.
Okay.
Oh, I guess I'll go. So my son likes to count. He's a numbers pattern kind of guy. And like I said, right now we're on a mission to figure out how to physically count to 1 billion. So I'll let you guys know how that is working out as well. In terms of self-care, I realized very early on that he's a visual learner. So we have a chart in his room and in the bathroom. We have to give him the order. So you pick up the toothbrush, you put the toothpaste, and you brush your teeth. He can follow directions that way, better than just me yelling at him or saying, brush your teeth. That works better for him. So we figure out how to do that. Getting him to tie his shoes is still a struggle. He hasn't mastered that at all, but he can put on simple laces and tie. I think he can tie basic laces, but he can't do the knots. But we're working on that. It's just a matter of me creating a chart to say step 1 through 90, and he's able to follow that, something visual. The pandemic, it's funny, I did share that with Stella. So all the entire 2019, I spent the whole year trying to socialize him. And it worked. It was working for what I think the summer of 2019, where he would go up to people. Hi, my name is Ethan. Do you want to play? And it was a great start. And fast forward to 2020, pandemic happens. We're quarantined, and I was telling him, okay, you can't touch anybody, no more handshaking, and you can't go up to people without a mask, and you have to stay 6 feet apart. But he'll tell me, but that's not really 6 feet. So now we're in this strange space where he doesn't quite understand what to do, because 2019 I told him, go out, hug people, shake hands, make friends. Now I'm saying no, 6 feet apart, stay away. He looks at me like I'm very confused. I'm taking us several steps back, and I'm reevaluating, well, what do I do? He understands he has to wash his hands frequently and wear a mask, but the social stuff, actually interacting with people, and we're in a new town now, and I'm just not quite sure how to move forward from that. So the pandemic has actually, whereas it helped Paul out, it hasn't helped me out at all in terms of I really have to figure out what's next in terms of getting him to be more open, and while following guidelines and staying 6 feet apart and not shaking anyone's hands. So it's just really funny.
What an exciting coincidence! Now, Stella, you answered this question already, if I'm correct. If I have not mistaken.
What, this one? No,
Yes.
I didn't. But
okay.
You can in the interest of time, maybe you can just go on to the next question. Yeah.
Sure. I wanted to make sure if everybody got the answer questions though, because I didn't want to, forget, because I just forgot about modeling before that though. So
it's okay.
It's okay. So for what does a child do for fun? So my next question is this: can you share an experience in which of lack of understanding lead to the exclusion of your child to service, groups, experience, etc.?
Oh, that I can talk about. I think, and I go back to, my son was bullied a lot, especially in junior high. Again, because, kids are not understanding, and you see someone different, and to a kid, that just means that they're easy prey. And so he went through a lot of, you have to understand, he is a social person. He wants to socialize. But that's the thing that's difficult for him. So in junior high, he was bullied a lot. In high school, when he tried to reach out to people to be friends with, they would see him coming and head in the other direction. I don't know what these kids had in mind. I guess, because I worked for many years in a high school myself, I could say they just didn't think about it. They didn't think about how he felt. They just thought that he was different and they didn't want to be bothered. So he was reaching out and they were running in the other direction. In high school, in college, he had the same difficulty where he wanted to socialize. And remember, I would say in general, many people with autism, they emotionally, they are maybe a good 10 years younger than their chronological age. So, but we expect them to, you're 18, so you should be functioning as an 18-year-old. But emotionally, they may not be 18, they could be considerably younger. So there's that incongruence. And people don't tend not to respond to that very well. And we're talking a lot about what we see in our kids. We haven't talked much about how it made us feel. Because when you see them struggling and it hurts your heart. You want to be able to, go grab all those kids and, say, shake them a little bit and say, what are you doing? But you can't. And you have to teach them how to grow, how to be in this world that isn't fully accepting of them, and not let your own pain show. And so he, in college, he was struggling. He wanted to hang out. He wanted to have the college experience. That's what he talked about all the time. He wants to have the college experience, which meant that he wanted to, hang out and be at parties and stuff like everyone else. And he would ask to go and they would tell him, sure, yeah, you can come. And then when he got to wherever they agreed to meet to, they were already gone. Because among themselves, they decided to meet earlier and head out. And he'd get there and there would be nobody there. And these things of course are very painful. They were painful to him and therefore they were painful to me, especially when there isn't too much you could do to fix it, because the problem is that other people weren't accepting and understanding. It's only when he found a meetup group on the internet of people more or less like him. They weren't all autistic, but they all had some sort of social difficulties. And so they started hanging out together. He met people like him who and they could understand each other. And then finally, as an adult, he got a group of friends that they could do things with.
Very
But
interesting.
it's very difficult for I can't speak for fathers, I'm sorry, Paul. I could only talk for mothers. It's very hard. It's very painful to not succumb to that pain that you're feeling, but also you have to rise above it and to try to teach your child all the things that they need to learn, and to reassure them that it's going to be okay. So it's almost like you have to hide your pain to help them to function, to learn to function the way they should. That I think is the difficulty of being a parent. Yeah.
And I think coming from the father's perspective, since uh, we have one fault as males. You were able to stop me. Well, you felt your heartbreaking for him. Going through that with the kids. Well, mine was the same thing. And when it happened, similar things happened. My heart broke on it, but then I also had to control myself because I had that male, go out there and, take care of it. Because you don't ever want that to happen to anybody. So there was that little added piece on that, but nowhere near as painful as honestly as a mother going through it. It's got to be. I mean, I can't even imagine it, but it's got to be even more difficult. So.
Yeah, the world can be very hurtful. It can be very, very hurtful without even. I don't know if they, not intentionally. I think people don't intend to be hurtful, but they are, and we see it, and we have to decide how are we going to teach our children to live in this world that is not what it should be, and to live successfully and to feel good about themselves, even when the world is telling you something different. It's a huge struggle.
And I would echo that, Stella, in saying, as a mom, you do get really stressed and overwhelmed sometimes with how folks treat your child. But I would also stretch that and say I get concerned about her sister as well, because her older sister loses out on opportunities because people are like, well, we don't want you to bring your sister, right? And so she is her sister's keeper.
Mm-hmm.
And so she will say no to events and programs because she's like, if my sister can't come, then I won't come, right? And then she takes it up on herself to say, try and educate her little teenage tribe on what autism is and to be sensitive. And so sometimes I feel like I don't want her to carry that burden. I don't want her to feel like it's her job to educate everyone around her on, what autism is she walks around with her little definition and she, talks to folks about her sister and how special her sister is. But that's also very stressful for a teenager, right? And it's also very stressful when your friends exclude you from things because they don't understand what your sister's going through. And so sometimes I have to say to her at this point, well, those folks are not real friends, right? Because your real friends would understand and they would know and they would support you. But once again, when you're a teenager and you're trying to fit in, you just want to fit in. You don't want anyone to have anything negative about you. You don't want anyone to say anything. And so sometimes I feel bad because she is super protective of her sister. And so, it's like someone says something and she goes, that's not happening. I'm not going, or she loses out on opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I think my son is definitely missing as a family member is the church community. And that's because I deliberately chose not to have him be included in that circle. So growing up as a devoted Christian and we're Pentecostals, it was a real community. I met some of my good friends there, going to church choir and you feel like you have a sense of real community where every Sunday or every Saturday you would meet up and you hang out and you study together. I cannot allow my son to join the church because of my specific church, of their willingness not to want the information, not to want the education. So for that, we go somewhere else where it's more inclusive, where the members and that person wants a lot of inclusion. They make it a priority. But it pains me that I had to leave the church that I grew up in and deprive my son of that, experience of being Caribbean American and go elsewhere because I'm protecting him in a way because he would not be welcome as much. And I would not want him to feel bad every Sunday being talked about or something. So I chose the liberty to exclude him from that because I would probably go crazy and have a mom reaction or say something that is just or overreact. And I would not want to do that. I want to teach him how to respond appropriately when things like that happen. But it pains me and it hurts me that I can't let him attend services in the church that I grew up in because I don't have the confidence that the environment would nurture him.
Yeah.
So the fact is that most people on the spectrum who have certain things that that particular people don't know about this is that what you guys have just talked about, like how are you guys feeling about the social interactions at other communities? So yes, it could be difficult in some communities because they don't attend to see what we went through, because at the end of the day, you'll come to a turning point that we may not go there anymore because they're judgmental. None of that's true. They just don't understand what we went through in life as the person on the Asperger's syndrome or the autism spectrum, because they're afraid that if the child acts up or anything, they think something's wrong with them, like in a psychotic way, which is not true. And it kind of offends a parent, and it can also ruin the child's his or her self-esteem. Anything can happen, because in this society, because the people in this world are not the nicest people as you think, because today's society is like pure devilness. What I mean devil is like people do bad things in life, in the world, that can lead to so many consequences in life.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Vincent, but unfortunately, sometimes what happens too is when the child acts up, they blame whom? The mothers.
Yeah.
Why you don't teach your child to behave? Why you're allowing the child to act up like that? So with all that you already have to deal with,
Yeah.
you have to deal with people who are looking at you askance because it's your fault why the child is not behaving in the way that they want the child to behave.
Right. And
so we get all this pressure put on us no matter what we do.
But that's true even when you look at it, even immediate family, if they don't fully understand. I mean, I remember when my son was very, young. I mean, he was, maybe a year old, 2 years old, somewhere in there. And because he had the ADHD, let's face it, he had more energy in a 10-second blast than I probably would have in a week. And so, you'd be in someone's house, for example, and, he'd be darting all over the place or touching this or touching that. And you wrangle him in as best as you can for the few moments. But I mean, how long can you hold a child for, when they're walking and they're doing stuff, and so people would look at you like, wait, don't you discipline your children?
Right.
Like, well, there's a level of discipline when you're dealing with a 2-year-old in general. Now add this extra piece onto it. So I think going back to what Madeline was saying, that is, and it's something that is, yes, cultural, yes, family. You can't even, when you can't get your immediate family. And then, believe me, my immediate family took a couple of years to get used. Now now everybody understands and everything's fine. But it took a couple of years to get to that point. It's like, listen, it's not that we have control over it. It's not like, I mean, I could discipline him from today till tomorrow. It's not going to make a difference. It's not going to change how, what he's got in him. So.
But on that note, Paul, it's also, sorry, Mom, it's also, I think I started this out saying that there are some people who are unwilling to learn and change their mindset. And at some point, you have to decide whether or not you want those folks in your circle. And I think to Maudlin's point, where her church family was, we're going to cut ties because you're unwilling to move over here, or at least move in the middle to try and understand. And I think I had to do that with some folks who I thought were really good friends, and we're saying some really harsh things. And I just wasn't going to allow that around her or around my family. That energy was not welcome.
So I do understand right now that at this point, it's where the conclusion is that some interactions with people can, like find a person who's also went through the same thing, because it could be like a connection. But if a person with a non-disability understands what you've been going through, even if that person has a disability or not, it's like a connection. It's like, or maybe you have a relative that was also on the same spectrum or other disabilities in life, and maybe that can give them some help they need in life, or probably that person can be trusted. And so from my perspective, it's always important to know what you want to do with that person, if you like that person or you want to hang around with that person, which is an okay opportunity. But as a person on the spectrum, it's also important to like study that person, make sure if it's trustworthy or not, and to make sure that he or she doesn't get hurt in such a way so that no person self-esteem will get destroyed in life. So that's my point of view of this perspective. So our next question is, what skills or talents does your child have that are at times undervalued in schools?
I could see Maudlin's son counting in class and the teacher tried to shut him up.
He taught himself Spanish, and it's funny because I don't speak Spanish, or my Spanish is really embarrassing. And he has a finesse for language, but this is a kid who struggles to express himself in English. But he is really like a numbers guy, and sometimes it gets in the way. He has a hard time transitioning when the activity is like number oriented. And so I'll get a phone call from the teacher saying, Ethan didn't have a good time today at all because we had to stop from this activity that he liked to this one. And to her what she's trying to tell me is that he has a hard time transitioning and he doesn't listen. And I said, well, it's just, if he really likes something, it's just hard for him. You have to find a way to give him some time. So if you want him to stop playing at 3:00, you can't tell him at 2:59. You have to find some kind of medium, maybe tell him at 2:50 and just give him a second warning, because it's just he's overwhelmed and excited to just practice and do this activity. So you have to kind of give him a warning that you may not have to give the next student. And so I regularly get phone calls and emails with that same complaint or concern that he has to transition. Yeah, it's just we're counting to 1 billion. So this is a kid who wakes up counting and dreams about numbers. And so it's a skill that I'm trying to figure out how to nurture better and trying to just, find a balance between what he really loves and what he has to do. So you really love something, but it doesn't mean you get to do it 24/7. You're gonna have to learn how to do things that you may not like, or you just, you like a little bit. So that's one strength I think the school and I haven't figured out how to best utilize, or how to get him to, how to get the best out of that.
I think that happens. And I mean, listen, when you have people who aren't on the spectrum, you're in the middle of doing something you like doing, you don't like transitioning to something else. So, right there, you're now dealing with somebody, who doesn't have that, ability. So, I mean, we had, a lot of situations like that also. And, we would have to talk with the teachers and say, listen, give him an extra minute on this or an extra minute on that. I remember one time he was in high school, and because of the schedule, one of his therapies had to happen during his lunch period. Okay, now you're going, he's there from, 8 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is, till 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and the lunch period now becomes the therapy session or whatever. And this particular teacher didn't like the fact that he would eat in the classroom. Not allowed to eat in the classroom. And so originally we arranged and said, listen, why can't he eat while the session's going on? And that was for like a day or two or whatever. And the fact of the matter is, where my son is concerned, if you give him an hour to eat, he will take 1 hour and 1 minute, right? Give him a half hour, he will take 31 minutes. I mean, that's just how it works. So so we were up there for an open school night, and this teacher was, complaining and all. And I just said, why don't we try something? I said, when my wife makes a sandwich in the morning, we're going to cut it into 4s, for example, whatever, something like that. I said, when he comes into the room, give him a time limit. Say, okay, you have the first 10 minutes to eat in, or 15 minutes, whatever that thing is, and then move into, his therapy and all. Well, I don't know if that's going to work. We'll try it. And about a week later, I get a phone call saying, thank you. Thank you. It worked. And so, again, it was just understanding that, understanding that if it's going to take this amount of time, give him, a few minutes less than that or whatever. And that's how we learned on that. In terms of, skills and talents at schools underestimate, you know what? I never really looked at that very closely to, what did they underestimate with him or overestimate with him? Because I think they do that with every student. You can't, you have a classroom with 20, 30 kids in it. Now, luckily, in his class, he was in a smaller classes, but still, you're going to underestimate someone's talents or skills, I think. And it's just, it's for us as parents who have to advocate for our children, is to be there and to, get people to look at it and realize it. And that's one thing, my wife specifically was very, very, very much an advocate, was up at the school all the time, was always, working with the teachers and always, working with the IEP and getting all of that done. And, to the point where the schools were even saying to us, you are one of the few parents that we of any of our students that we see who take an active role in their, with their child. And I think that's how you get people to see where the strengths are in the child, whether it's math or science or whatever, because they're going to be, my son was excellent in math for, a long time, and computer skills and things like that, to a point where, and I'm not even close. So, but that's how, that's what you got to do. It's really us being advocates and just making sure that we're there to fight for every little thing. And then people start respecting that.
Mhm.
And when they're respecting that, that's when actually you start seeing some of them become more proactive. Right. So when my wife was up there for the IEPs and doing all of that, finally, there were times where we would get a phone call from the person who was in charge of writing the IEP for that year or whatever, asking, hey, we just want to know, how do you feel about this, 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 and this? But that was later on in the process. At the beginning, they didn't even care what we thought or not, or what was good for us. So it's just a matter of being there consistently and fighting and fighting and fighting. And then you get them to understand that you're serious about, what's going on. So.
Well, I wanted to add that schools and districts have a hard time, or the people who write these IEP evaluations, because they're only focusing on the weaknesses, like, what they don't understand or what they don't see or what's missing or whatever gap. Whereas, when you're the parent, and if you're a good advocator for your kid, you'll say, okay, I understand he needs to work on the following, not denying that, he really does. But at the same time, to make it a balanced report, look at what he does do well or exceptionally well. And half the time you're the only parent in the room saying, wait, it's not just a list of deficits, but try to include like some strengths and use the strengths to kind of balance out what you call deficits. But you have to be in the room and be that annoying mother and father to really say, you're only looking at it this way. And that's because you're trained to look at it this way. So I'm not blaming you. But has the child's parent and the person who spends most time with him or her, I'm telling you to look at the full person, so that way your document, this IEP, is a holistic document. And sometimes you find yourself screaming, saying it's not all, he can't, she can't. He or she can do some things more than you and I. And so it's just I always say, no, if there are two things that he can do right, let's find one thing that he does right. That way we're approaching it, we're looking at it both ways. And that takes a strong advocator. You have to be willing to do that every meeting,
Absolutely.
every decision, and every IEP meeting.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely.
I mean, story when we were starting this conversation a few months ago, where we were trying to get my son mainstreamed for math, because he was in the inclusion program and all that stuff, but then we wanted him mainstream. And because they couldn't do what you were just pointing out, because they couldn't do that, they kept holding him back in the math class. Well, he'll stay in this, but we wanted to get him mainstreamed into a general ed math class because we knew he could do well. We had to take it up to the chancellor's office. The chancellor's office finally, said yes. And that was in the middle of the summer. That was like in, August or something. They said, yes, we're going to put him into a general class. Well, the school sat on it till about 3 or 4 weeks into the semester. We were there fighting the whole time. Hey, the chancellor's office said, we're trying to find a place for him this way, and we went through this whole thing. 3 weeks go by. And as we're going into week 2, they're saying to me, well, we don't see how he can make it in that class. I said, you don't know because we haven't tried. Well, I don't know. And so now we're 3 weeks into the semester. They put him into that class, literally just drop him now into this new class. Wait a week and a half, call me up and go, it's not working. Well, yeah, what'd you expect? Now he can't, now it's, so they kind of, so you're right. They were working on just, they had their motive that they wanted. They only saw one negative. And so they immediately pull him out and it never, and then it wasn't until, a year later that we were able to sign it. But again, it's that fight constantly to the point where, why as a parent saying, you see what my child does, you see his grades, you see the work he's done, and are you fighting with me to not let him go? Because you know what? They get more money for certain programs if they keep them this way, or they get less if they move them out. Any number of reasons becomes their ulterior motive, and it's not necessarily in the interest of your child.
Right.
And so that's a big problem. And that's why parents always, and you know what, I think even for parents whose kids are not on the spectrum, I never understood why parents don't get involved somehow. The kids come home, they don't even ask them if they have homework half the time. They go to school, they come home, and then parents don't take any interest in it. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Well, I agree
Yes.
with both you and, sorry, Vincent, just one quick thing I want
Of course.
to say.
Go ahead.
I always tell folks that it does take a village, right? And I believe that the teachers and the therapists and the district and all of those folks are in the village. But what I do say to them is, I am the head of the village, right? And so you can be in my village, but I am the head of the village. And while you are the expert in your field, I am an expert in my child. And so you need to listen to me when I have a seat at the table, and I walk into the IEP meeting or I walk into the district meeting saying, hey, this is what I want. I explained it to the district superintendent last year that my intention is that my daughter will get a college education. And in order for her to do that, you have to start teaching her math in the 3rd grade. You can't tell me that at 10 years old, you're going to make the decision that she will not be ready for college at 18 because you're not equipping your teachers to teach her math right now. So you need to equipped your teachers. You need to mainstream my daughter because here's what she needs to do in order to graduate. I have a plan, she has a plan. And the plan is she will graduate with a college degree. How are we going to get there? You can be with me or you can't be with me. But I am the only expert on my child, and you can come be a part of my village or not.
That is very true. I think the whole,
I agree.
I think the whole system is, the system is set up in a very stereotypical way, where there are certain expectations of each child in the class. And when one child is different, then instead of embracing that difference becomes a problem. And so I only got calls from the teachers when there was a problem. Nobody ever contacted me to say, oh, your son did brilliantly on this test, or your son did, it was always, your son is hanging on the stalls in the bathroom. But what do you want me to do? Leave work and come and get him off the stall? Come on, So I think it's set up that way. And what we would like to see, as much as 100% I agree with you, Tashika, you have to fight for your child, but there's also a much bigger fight. How do we change the concept of what a classroom should look like, or what students in a classroom should look like? Because when we get to change that concept, then we would have less of a backlog. Not we, but any individual parent would have less of a battle, because there's more openness to accept the differences.
Mm-hmm.
Because our children are dealing with enough. Being autistic in a world that is not open to them, not really fully accepting. I have to say it has improved considerably from what it was, but it's still not totally accepting of them. And that is difficult enough in itself. It's difficult enough for us as parents in itself. If only we could open things up, allow people to just see the beauty in our children, the strengths in our children. Yes, they won't do things at the same time as other people. My son was 35 before he left home to go live on his own. 35. Even his younger sister had already left home to live on her own before he left. But he's doing it, and doing it successfully now. He's doing fine. Of course, I was very, very worried when he left. I saw everything was going to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. He was fine. But they won't do things at the same rate, at the same time as others. If we can get just the whole school system, the education system, to accept that, then life would be a little easier for them.
To not pass judgment before you walk in the room, right? Or
right.
For folks to sit there and I have to explain to them a least restrictive environment. I don't work for the Board of Ed. You need to know what that is. You need to understand what my daughter, needs in order to be supportive. But, like Paul was saying, it's every parent, you expect them to be fully engaged. But as a parent with a child with special needs, it goes above and beyond that engagement, right? It really sucks up a lot of time and energy, and not in a negative way, to be that advocate and to make sure you're on top of your game for when you walk into that room, because there is already going to be judgment before you walk into the door.
So we're living with a level of stress. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for this thing, though, there is a saying that everybody mostly says in the society: don't judge a book by its cover, because you would not know that person that well once you meet that person, like today or something like that. Because if you already met that person for one day, and then you soon to come out of your mouth saying that, oh, this person is blah 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 blah. No, that is something that people need to know, and what they need to know is that why are you in this world? Because most people today are accepted by these people with intellectual disabilities today, which is very helpful. And from Stella's perspective, I understand what she said about coming out of the shells, and how people can like relate to that, coming out of their emotions and letting them know how much you love that person, even if he or she has no intellectual disabilities to a child. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that they're human beings like everybody else is. That is what is important in our society. Everybody should be equal from here and through here. That is my perspective.
That's right.
And for our final question, name one thing that society needs to change in order to be more inclusive of more of people on the spectrum.
I think what I just said, that we need to open up our perspective of what normal is. We have a very narrow definition of the word normal, and I think, there are now people in the field they don't even want to use the word normal anymore, and they prefer to use the word typical. But if we and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think after a while, if we don't change our perspective of things, no matter what word we use, that word after a while gets just as narrowly defined as whatever word we used before. So I think it's language is important, words are important, but I also think that we just need to open up our perspective about what is accepted in society. We have a way too narrow definition of what is acceptable, and if we could just open that up, and it's going to be gradual, but we need to start opening it up so that we can accept a wider range of personalities and abilities into our idea of acceptable in society.
I would agree, Stella, and I would also suggest open minds equals open hearts, right? And so if you are willing to learn, and education is the key, as parents, as advocates, we have to continue to educate as well. I think that Stella or Paul can answer this best. What we knew 10 years ago or 20 years ago is different from what we know now. The services that Monla's son and my daughter has weren't even available for Paul or Stella's son at some point, right? And so that education is key, advocacy is key, and I think we just have to, like anything else, keep pushing and fighting for what we believe is right for all of our children.
And again, when my son was very young and he was first diagnosed, we fought for the services that we were able to get him, and they were so new in the city and the services that it was like, so we would get a diagnosis from a neurologist or whatever, then we would have to go to this psychologist who would then have to do another diagnosis, and then the Board of Ed would have to do this separate diagnosis, all this so that we could get him a speech therapist. It was like, okay, and then it was another fight for something else. But now I think it's become more commonplace, again, because they've realized that the early intervention is really what what you need, right? Because that, puts in a whole sense of training. I mean, and I would say earlier than my son, they were talking about different, shock therapies and things like that, I mean,
Mhm.
behavioral modifications that, no, how about we teach, and because one thing I think that somebody who's Asperger's, they learn pretty easily within themselves. We may not see that, right? But once they've gotten that lesson, it's here and it's a lot. Sometimes frustratingly locked, but it's locked and they learn it. We just may not see it right away, or we might not be able. So I think that really, if you ask me, what does society need to do? They need education. I'm not sure how you do that with at least here in the United States with 350 million people, but it has somehow there has to be. Listen, we have been educated on so many other things in the last year. We've all learned a lot as a whole
Mhm.
entire society, right? Well, maybe this needs to be almost looked at like an epidemic of some kind and teach it that way. I don't know, but education is the key to it. People have to learn that that not everybody thinks or sees things the way we do. And then, by the way, that we're talking about it as for people who are on the spectrum. I'm saying for society in general, we
Mhm.
have to learn that
Mhm.
that people have different thoughts. So.
Mhm.
I think one thing society needs to change is the need to categorize just because it's easy. And so with autism, it's a spectrum because it's hard to categorize. So it's just, I find that most people they do need the knowledge and the education, but then even if you give them information, they still try to organize or fit you into a box. And that's what, most human beings, it makes it much easier for me to say, I'll put you there, I'll put you here, I'll put you there. And it's really hard to do that with someone who's on the spectrum. So I think at the end of the day, it's what Tashika and Paul and Stella have echoed is education, but also recognizing that when you can't box someone into whatever narrative that you may think applies to them, that it's okay. That you may not always figure someone out, based on outward appearances. And I think with some of the people that I encounter, that's a basic struggle for them. Like I can't place you in this square box because I don't understand, or I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure if I think we just get rid of whatever box or preconceived notion. Because I think it's just the more you fight to hold on to that, to categorize people, the more you're unwilling to see them for who they are. And so I think one of the biggest problems is just for us to have the need not to fit people into whatever narratives or boxes that we perceive or that we think they belong in.
And then hold them at fault when they don't fit into your box that you have created for them. Then, it's okay if they don't fit into the box. Then you can say, okay, I'll destroy the box. But what most people say is, it's your fault why you don't fix into this box. You fix yourself so that you could fit into the box that I have created. And I think that's where the problem is. So it's the person who doesn't fit who is at fault, not the box. And that's what needs to change. Either change the shape of the
Absolutely.
box or get rid of the box altogether.
Get rid of the box altogether.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because there is such beauty, there is such beauty and such strength and such everything positive that you could see if only you take your eyes off the box and look at the person.
That is 100% true, Stella. I have to agree with you on that. 100% clear on that. Absolutely. I must have to say, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, panelists, for answering my questions. I thank you so much, and hope for the future plans for your kids. Much respect as a person on the autism spectrum. So if we have 15 minutes, once again, thank you guys so much. We have like 15 minutes. And do we have any other questions for the attendees? Do we have any questions for the entities and For as a parent, what is one piece of advice you might give other parents of people on the spectrum?
Ooh.
I-
Hang in there,
I
it
would
gets
say-
better.
I would say that, but I would also say that, this is your process and it's your journey with your child, and you have to trust yourself and trust your gut, that you know what is best for your child. There will be difficulties. There will be days where you just want to run outside screaming and yelling. There will be challenges because, like Paul would says, as a wife, I do 99.99% of the paperwork, the scheduling, the appointments, the meetings for my daughter, right? And so there are days where I want to, find my husband and shake him a couple of times. Like, can you just fax this one paper? And so there's going to be frustration within the partnership as well. And I would just say, you just got to balance that out and lean on each other and really trust your process. It's not an easy one by any means, but if you have a support system and if for me, do your research and know what you're looking at and what you want to advocate for your child, it's all worth it.
I think always being an advocate. I mean, just know that it's not going to be an easy trek, and you're going to fight, but it's going to all be worth it. At the end. And Tashika, you're 100% right. I mean, my wife did more than the lion's share on all of it. And it's. How just being there as a support mechanism sometimes is just as important. But I could say that from my perspective. There were days. But one of the things from our children aside for a moment, but in the relationship side, things like this can either really bring you stronger and stronger together or can rip you apart. And I will say that with my wife and all, it brought us a lot closer. But I've seen people who have been split up and destroyed because of it. So you got to fight for two things now. You have to fight and advocate for your child, and you have to fight and advocate for your relationship as well. So it does become a little bit more difficult, but again, worth it in the end, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I would repeat what Shashika said, and it's just be the expert in the village, and whoever is unwilling or might hurt or not help you nurture your child, get rid of them, because it's not worth your sanity, it's not worth your time. And I find myself constantly evaluating and restructuring my village for the benefit of my child and my sanity.
100% true, Madeline, 100%. And I have to agree with you on that. I must say, and one more advice on this one. Why as the people on the autism spectrum, as myself, I ask myself, why can't we be like other people who like normal? But we can't because we are born what we have, and we can't get rid of it. Because once you're born with it, you can't get rid of it. At least you can try to fight for it, though, that you could become an outspoken person in life in the future. And for this thing, another question that you ask yourself, what can I do to make yourself succeed in life? And furthermore, you have to learn from it, though, get educated. You have to need to success for yourself and for your family, because everybody in this society, there are a lot of people in this world who need money to live and to survive in this world. And also they need to have like opportunities of themselves in order not for them to be like where they can live like in the shelter where you are forced to have to do something, or like, you know, like have like bed hours, shelters like that. It hurts. But what matters is that everybody has life in their hands. Everybody has like different perspective in their life. And also they need to have like opportunities on themselves to become a successful person in that industry, and to also gain confidence of themselves, not giving up on themselves, and to also feel more comfortable and socialization with other people around you, and people who care for you and people who support you in your life. That all that matters. What matters is that you are for who you are and what you are doing with your life. And that's
Right.
what's important in this society.
Absolutely.
And again, I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank you so much on behalf of Peter, Santiago. That God bless you guys, and may for the future be better for you. God bless you. Thank you.
Vincent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also wanted to take a moment to thank Vincent for doing such a great job as our
Thank you.
moderator today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And to thank everybody who came today and who's still here and followed this conversation very closely. You all did an amazing job. Thanks for sharing your experience.